Good. Yes, I hope we are recording. Let me adjust the camera. So we start with the introduction. Start with what's called introduction. Introduction. We say to public finance. Introduction to public finance. Introduction to what we call public finance. Introduction to the public finance. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me, Lizzie? I hope you can hear me. If you can hear me, you respond with a yes. Perfect. So we start with what we call nature and the scope of public finance. What is called the nature? Nature. And we say in the scope. In the scope of what we call public finance. So nature and the scope of public finance. Nature and the scope of public finance. So the first thing that I want us to define, is definition of public finance. We call it a definition of what we call public finance. So definition of what we call public finance. Definition of public finance. So when you have two things, I have the first word to be public, the second word to be finance. Are we together? So the first word, we call it public, and the second word refers to what we call finance. So when you talk about public, this basically refers to what we call the general people. General people. And the second, whenever we talk about finances, we talk about this is resources. These are basically what we call resources altogether. So when you talk about public, that refers to general people. That refers to what we call general people. Are we together? That refers to the general people. Are we together? Refers to general people. And then when you talk about finance, we refers to resources. So when you talk about public finance, we understand that this means resources. Public finance is definitely resources. We call it resources of the masses. Are we together? So resources of the masses. At the back of your mind, I want you to understand that when government collects taxes, those are not the government's money, but those are resources for the masses, the public altogether. The taxes that are collected, are we together? The money that is collected by both the county government and the national government is resources for the people. Those are public finances altogether. So when you talk about public finances, we basically talk about resources for the masses altogether. But in management, we'll talk about how these resources are definitely collected, and utilized. How we collect these resources and how we get to utilize those resources. When you talk about public finances, we are basically going to talk about two things: how these resources are basically collected and how they are utilized. Respond with a yes if you're together. Respond with a yes if you're together. So how resources for the government are basically collected and utilized together. So whenever we talk about fundamentally, whenever we talk about public finances, whenever we talk about public finances, or the discipline of public finance, basically describes, this basically describe or highlight, describe and analyzes, and we say analyzes what we call the government services, analyze what we call the government services. Public finance describe and analyze government services. subsidies, and what's called welfare. Subsidies and what's called the welfare. Subsidies and welfare payments. Welfare payments. And methods. And what's called the methods by which expenditures, by which the expenditure, to this end, we say are basically covered, we say through taxation. Expenditure to these ends are essentially covered through taxation. So when I proceed to the nature and scope, I now talk nature and scope of what we call public finance. So in simple words, when you talk about public finance, which is a question that may not come, we say that management of resources for the masses. Alan, are we together? Management of resources for the masses altogether. How government get to raise money, are we together? And how the money that is raised is basically spent altogether. Management of the resources for the masses altogether. So when you talk about scope, we basically mean that public finance can basically be a science, and at the same time, we can have it as an art. So the scope, public finance, can basically be a science, and at the same time, public finance can be called an art altogether. So why would we, in terms of scope, why would you relate public finance as a science? That is a big question. Why would we relate public finance as a science? And you must enjoy. I know for some people, it's the first time to meet this, but for those who have met me before, we've always met in the morning. Is it true, Awiko Dangote? So make it an habit to wake up very early in the morning and sometimes do our study. It's for our own personal benefit altogether. It is not meant to push you to the corner, but it's meant that at the time we are doing exam, all of us are able to get to a place where they'll go to the paper and say, Mwalimu did everything. That is where we want. But of course, very important, as I also talk, is the assignment. The assignment I've marked, for those who sent it, I think I've marked those assignments. For those who have not sent, those are the ones that have not marked the assignment. So try so that as I give back, make sure you're part of the team. Assignment works very well for any unit altogether. If you do the assignment, the better it is. So in terms of scope, we have public finance acting as a science, but at the same time, public finance basically acting as a science altogether. So when you talk about public finance, I hope you said public finance, when you talk about public finance as a science, we need to understand that science is basically a systematic study of any subject which studies relationship between facts. Relationships are study relationship, what we call relationship, we call it between what we call facts. So whenever we talk about science, it basically studies what we call relationship between what we call fact, relationship between facts altogether. On the other side, when you talk about an art, application of knowledge for achieving a definite objective. So an art is application of what I call knowledge, we say for achieving what I call a definite objective. That is what we call an art. So what we call application of a knowledge to achieve what we call a definite objective together. So a science is a systematic body of knowledge which studies what we call relationship between facts. But now when I talk about science, when I talk about an art, is basically now application of knowledge to achieve what's called a definite objective. The question is, why is public finance a science? Why is it a science? Why is public finance in terms of scope a science? Are we together? Why is it a science? That is a big question in the room. Anna, Alan, Lizzie, Evans, Jojo, Meshach Maingi. Why is public finance now basically called a science? Why do we basically call it science? I need us to understand that it is a science because it studies various, we say it studies various, we call it various principles. Why is it a science? It basically studies various principles, problems. Are we together? Various principles, and you call it problems. Various principles, and you call it problems. Various principles, problems. It basically studies various principles, problems, and policies, and what you call and policies. Policies. It's saying underlying various policies, and we call it underlying spending, and what you call and raising. Underlying what you call spending and raising of funds by what you call by the public. By public. So it basically studies what you call principles, programs, policies that underlie spending and raising what we call funds for public authorities. Public authorities. Raising of what we call funds for what we call public authorities. So in summary, so if you look at public finance, it will teach you how to collect what we call taxes in the best way and how to maintain economy, how to collect taxes and how to maintain economy, and how to spend them properly. You know, how do we collect taxes? How do we spend them properly? How do we maintain economy together? Taxes, how do we collect the taxes? How do we spend the taxes? And how do we maintain the economy together? How does the collection of taxes relate to maintaining the economy? And how does collection of taxes relate to now spending them to for the benefit of the population? That is why we call it a science. Are we together? So I say that an art is a means of achieving what we call a definite objective. Why is public finance an art? That is a big question. Why is public finance an art? A means of achieving a definite objective. So what are we going to achieve when we study public finance? Essentially, what are we going to achieve by studying what's called public finance? You solve financial problems in the government. It assists you to solve what you call financial problems, number one, in the government. Are we together? The knowledge that you have in public finance, if you look at it, it will basically assist you to solve financial problems in the government in the best possible way. Together, in the best possible way, in the best possible way, in the best possible way. So I was asking Meshach Maingi, how do you solve financial problems in the government in the best possible way? How do you basically solve? You know, so you say as an art, it basically helps you to solve financial problems in government in the best possible way. How do you solve issues pertaining to finances in the government in the best possible way? How do you solve financial problems? You know, raising of revenue, can also borrow, collection of taxes, but if taxes are not enough, we can borrow. Are we together? That's why we have debt. If you look at topic 6, we have what we call debt management. That apart from, you know, we understand that the huge source of government revenue basically comes from taxes. But we both basically also understand that the government can also solve issues pertaining to finances in terms of borrowing. Are we together? So when you talk about public finances, it is in terms of scope. It is basically, it is studies what called income and expenditures of government. In 5, it is in terms of scope. It is basically in terms of scope. In terms of scope, we basically understand that it studies what's called income and expenditure, and we have them in basically in 5 broad ways. So in terms of scope, we have what's called public revenue. Public revenue. It touches on public revenue. Public revenue in terms of scope. We have what's called public expenditure. Again, public expenditure. This is one area that public finance, public expenditure. We have what we call the public expenditure. We have what's called the public debt. Public debt. We have the public debt. Public debt. Number 4, we have what's called economic stability. Economic stability. And then we have what's called fiscal administration. We have financial administration. We have what's called financial administration. We have what's called financial administration. So in terms of scope, public finance basically covers those areas. We have what's called the public revenue. We have the public expenditure. We have what's called the public debt. And then we have what's called economic stability. Then we have what's called the financial administration. Together, team. And then we have what's called the financial administration. Together, in terms of scope, respond with a yes. And I want us to enjoy our class. Always in life, make sure that you give it to your best. Make sure that we always give it our best. Yes. And we honor God. We give it our best and we honor God. Yes. Everything that we do, we serve. We are always serving. And that is the best thing that we can always do to ourselves. So then I start with the first one. When you talk about public revenue, I start with the first one. We call it public revenue. We start with the first one. In terms of scope, we have what we call the public revenue. So whenever we talk about public revenue, is basically concerned or concentrated with what we call revenue raising by public. So this is revenue raising. We call it, in terms of scope, revenue, we call it raising. This is basically concerned with what's called the revenue raising by the public. So when you talk about public revenue raising, are we together? So classification, again, we need to understand that classification, we have what's called classification of various resources of public into taxes, classification of various resources of the public into taxes altogether. But again, also, on the public revenue, we're also going to touch on aspects of principles of taxation altogether. Concentrate with how government basically raises revenue. We touch on what we call principles of taxation. But essentially, we are classifying various resources of what we call public into taxes. That is on the public revenue as the first scope. Together, team? Yes. But I'll just summarize revenue raising. Are we together? But we touch on principles of taxation, and now we classify various resources of the government into taxes. Is that at home, Jojo? Jojo, is that at home? Perfect. If Jojo be at home on the first explanation, I hope we are at home. So the second, in terms of scope, we have what's called public expenditure. Are we together? Expenditure is how government basically now uses the revenue that's collected. When you talk about public expenditure, now we talk about how government basically uses the revenue that is collected. But fundamentally, when I talk about what's called public expenditure, you need to understand that it studies what's called fundamental principles that govern flow of government fund. Govern flow of government, we call it government fund, we say into various stream. Flow government fund, and you say into various stream. You know, how government expenditures basically. How is the flow of government revenue, government fund into various stream? How there's a flow of government fund into various stream altogether. So then I have the next, which called the public debt altogether. Whenever we talk about public debt, this is basically borrowing altogether, and we talk about concerned with the problem of raising loans. Raising loans, you know, how do we raising loans? You know, when you talk about public debt, this is borrowing. And so then when you talk about borrowing, this is basically concerned with how we definitely raise what you call loans together. Then I want to talk about what we call financial administration together by government in a particular year. So raising of loans together, as we'll be talking about public debt management, we can raise loans internally and we can raise loans externally. Well, the government can borrow internally, but at the same time, the government may also borrow externally. At the same time, the government may borrow externally. So then the next scope, I talk about financial administration. When we talk about what we call financial administration, we just make them brief. So on financial administration, we basically understand that our organization and administration of financial mechanisms of government are we together? Organization and what's called administration, organization, and what's called administration. We call it organization and administration. Organization and administration of financial mechanism by government of what we call financial, call it mechanism, and say by government. Mechanism by government. So organization and administration of what we call financial mechanism, and you say by the government. And how does government do that? It basically use it through government machinery. Then lastly, we have what's called economic stability together. So when you talk about economic stability, those are policies and measures of government to bring stability. Policies, and what's called measures to bring what's called stability, stability. So in terms of scope, it basically touches on those areas. How much? That is in terms of scope. It basically touches on those areas. That is where the public finance touches on together. So if you ask areas that public finance basically covers, you talk about those 5 areas. Tafadhali nipatie yes. We respond with yes. So then I want to talk about overview of what we call financial management. Overview of what we call financial management. Financial management. You say as envisaged in what's called in the Constitution 2010. So we call it an overview of financial management as basically envisioned in the Constitution of 2010. So who has read the Constitution of 2010? Have you taken time to look at the Constitution, the PFM Act? Are we together? The procurement laws? Have you ever looked at the Constitution of 2010? So that is a number of questions we'll be touching on this area. We have the PFM Act altogether. PFM Act, you looked at them. Yes, Chapter 12. It talks about are we together? So that is the Chapter 12 of Constitution. So what will this is basically on the chapter. We have it as Chapter 12 of what we call the Constitution. I hope you have a copy of Constitution. One of the things we said, one of our small Bible for public finance, that constitution will assist us. The PFM Act and others will assist us greatly in understanding a number of issues or two. So, overview of financial management as envisaged in what we call the Constitution. But I want to talk about a number of things, that are very fundamental for us to understand. A number of things that we need on that Constitution that are very important. So I've said number one is chapter 12. Are we together? It talks about the principles of handling that applies to all public money, which emphasize on a number of things. We have what we call accountability and participation on how the money is being used. Participation on how the money is being used together. So in those chapters, those fundamental areas are divided into seven altogether. But very important altogether. If today, for example, I was to ask a class that if I give Lizzie 100 million and there's no oversight, Lizzie, what will you do with 100 million? If I give you 100 million and there's nobody to check you, what would happen? And there's nobody to check you. Lizzie just laughs. Yes, automatically, it doesn't matter who you are. The positions where you put yourself, yes, the positions, whether you're a Christian, whether, that's why we have principles to live by. Without principles, without the word of God, without understanding the boundaries, even nobody is perfect altogether. All of us will break. That's why we have principles altogether. And just like public money, when you have public money without accountability or oversight, the people in positions of power would use those money. So in that chapter 7, we basically divide them in 7 distinct functional parts. 7, we call them 7 distinct functional parts. Distinct parts. So 7 distinct parts. So I want us to put those parts down. Then we discuss those parts. Very importantly, we discuss. The first part is principles and framework of public finance. Very important. Principle, we call it principle, and what's called framework of what we call public finance. Principle and framework of what we call public finance together. Principles and what we call framework of what we call the public finance. Then we have what we call other public finance, public funds, other public funds. That is number 2, other public finance, other public funds. We have what's called revenue raising powers. Revenue raising powers. We'll talk about revenue raising powers. And we have what's called public debt. So revenue raising powers and what's called the public debt. Revenue raising power and what's called the public debt. Then we have what's called revenue allocation. We have what's called the revenue allocation. What we call the revenue allocation. The next we have what's called the revenue allocation. Then we have 5 budgets and spending. Budgets, and what's called spending. We have what's called the budget and spending. That is 5. Number 7, we have what's called control of public money. Control of what we call public money. And finally, number 7, we have what's called financial officers and institutions. We call it financial officers and what's called institutions. Financial officers and what's called the institution. These are the 5 distinct parts that I want us to discuss. So I want us to right away go to the principles and framework. The first one, principle, and what's called framework of what we call of public finance. Principles and what we call framework of what we call the public finance together. So what are the principles that guide public finance altogether? principles of public finance together. Principles of public finance. So we start with the first one, which is called principles. This is a very common, this is a question that was tested in 2023. Principles of what we call the public finance. So what is principles that basically guide public finance management? And I'll say that if you look at 2023, this question was tested. I'll be able to highlight. So what I will do is that after class, I just give questions so that you go back and do. So instead of even revising, I know where those questions is. I know this one is in 2023. I pick questions on what we have done, Are we together? So we have what we call Article 201. Not very important altogether. You cannot be asked on this article. Article 201. Article 201. It talks about principles that guide aspects of public finance. Principles of that guides what you call public finance. Principles that guides what you call the public finance. So we have it as Article 201. So we have about 5 principles. And I think if you look at this particular question, it was tested around 2020, 2023. Together, Meshach. There's a gentleman who was called Meshach. Meshach is not admin. I hope you're there. You're the admin. So if you look at Article 201, but these ones you may never be asked together. So it talks about principles that guides what you call public finance. Principles that guides what you call public finance. Are we together? So one is openness and accountability as one of the first principles. Openness and what's called accountability. That is the first principle, accountability. I've looked at this question. I've told you, if you look at 2023, you'll find this question was tested. Openness and what's called accountability. Those ones include what's called public participation. What do you have as what's called public participation? Participation in financial matters. In what you call in financial matters. Public participation in what you call the financial matters. But you have what you call openness and what's called accountability. For those who basically intend to work with the government, you can be asked a question, that what is the essence of public participation? For example, if today you go to an interview and some of the things that I'm teaching you are some of the things like the IFMIS, we're going to talk about when talking about procurement. I'm going to talk about IFMIS. But now, what is the essence of public participation? Why do you think government have public participation? I said one of the first principles is openness and accountability. That includes public participation in financial matters. Why do we have public participation? When a government is passing a bill, we have a public participation. What is the essence of public participation? Somebody. Inclusivity. Perfect. To authenticate the process. Definitely inclusivity. But at the same time, to authenticate the process, to make the process legit or to be more inclusive. So the first principle is what we call openness and accountability. So this question I've said was tested in 2023, principles of public finance management. The second is equitable public finance system. We call it equitable. We call it the equitable public finance system. Public finance system. What they call the equitable public finance system. We have it as the equitable public finance system. So whenever we talk about equitable public finance system, the 3 aspects that we talk about, are we together? One is sharing of the burden of taxation fair. Sharing of what we call the burden of what we call taxation, sharing the burden of taxation fairly. We have it as sharing what we call the burden of taxation fairly. So on equitable public finance system, we have what we call sharing what we call the burden of taxation fairly. Then we say sharing revenue raised among sharing revenue raised, sharing what you call the revenue raised between what you call the national, and what's called the county government. Between the national and what's called the county government, are we together? Then equitable development of a country. On equitable development of a country, we have what's called equitable development of what you call of a country. Equitable development of a country. Equitable development of a country. So we have the next is what we call equitable development of a country. We call it the equitable development of a country. We call it the equitable development of a country. We call it the equitable development of a country. We call it equitable. Point two says sharing of revenue equitably between national and county government. Between national and county government, equitable sharing of revenue between national and county government. Sawa. Is that at home? Equitable sharing of revenue between national and what's called the county government. Equitable sharing of what we call the national revenue between the national government and the county government. Again, we are going to synthesize on that. As I get some ink, we are going to synthesize on that information. So don't worry. But as a break to get some ink, how does the government basically share revenue between the national and county government? How do they share? How does government basically share? How does government basically share revenue between what's called the national and county government? Mm. 5%. We'll talk about that. 5%. No. Yes, but it can be greater. We say greater than 15%. So we have three levels. We have Equalization Fund. We have what's called the Equalization Fund. So in terms of sharing, we're going to talk about it all together. We basically understand that when it comes to sharing, we have the national government having less than 84.5. We have the county government, they can have greater than 15. Then you have what's called Equalization Fund, that is 0.5. Together, 0.5. 0.5. So the national government has about less than 84.5 or less than. So we have the national government always having a huge chunk, which can be less than 84.5 or less than 84.5. The county will always have 15 or more. Together, team will respond with a yes. So that is on equitable public finance system and on the three aspects together. So then we have the third principle. We'll move to the third principles of public finance management. The third principle on public finance management, we say equitable sharing between, we call it equitable, we call it sharing, and say between what we call the present, and what's called and the future, between the present and the future, equitable sharing between the present and the future generation, the burdens and benefit between the present and future generation. We call it the burden, and what's called the benefit, burden and benefit of what we call burden and benefit of what we call resources and public borrowing, of resources and what's called the public borrowing. In terms of debt, do you think we share the same? Look at those who those who were there in the 70s. In terms of public debt, those were there in the 70s and 80s. Do you think it's equitable? Do you think it's equitable? We stand at 11 trillion. In terms of the burden of borrowing, it's not very much equitable in terms of burden of borrowing. So it's saying that another principle, there should be equitable sharing between the present and the future generation, the burden of what we call resources and public expenditure. In terms of expenditure, you realize that the current generation admin is paying a lot in terms of expenditure. Then we have what's called prudent and responsible use of public money. We have what's called number 4, prudent. We call it prudent. And what's called responsible. We say use of what we call public money. Use of what we call public money. So we have it as prudent and what's called responsible use of public money. So what we call the prudent and responsible use of public money. And the last principle, we call it responsible financial management and clear fiscal reporting. Responsible, we call it as responsible. Responsible, we have it as responsible. Responsible financial management. Financial management. And what's called clear, we call it fiscal reporting. What we call the clear fiscal reporting. So we have it as responsible financial management and what's called clear fiscal reporting. And we call it clear fiscal reporting together. So if you ask, those are the 5 principles of public finance management together. If you ask on this question and say 23 principles of public finance, there are 5. Openness and accountability, equitable public finance system, and we have the 3 aspects. Then we have equitable sharing between present and future, the burden and benefit of resources and public resources, prudent and responsible use of public money, and then we have responsible financial management and what's called fiscal policy. So then, still on that number 1, I want to talk about what we call equitable sharing of national revenue. Still on the first principle, equitable sharing. I want to talk about B, equitable. We'll call it equitable sharing. Equitable sharing of national revenue, of what we call national. Equitable sharing of what we call the national revenue. We talk about equitable sharing of what we call the national revenue. Equitable sharing of what we call the national revenue together. So when I look at chapter 12 of the Constitution, that is basically on Article 203. We have it Article 203. We have that on the Article 203. Are we together? We have that on Article 203. Takes into consideration, are we together? Takes into consideration, takes into account in determining what's called equitable share of national revenue to the counties altogether, to the national revenue to the county altogether. So equitable sharing. So this question, I also want to talk about equitable sharing. The latest, it was touched on 2020, 2024. Are we together? Parameters. What do we use altogether? What are some of the conditions taken into account in determining equitable sharing of national revenue from national government to counties? So we call it we call it condition. I said 2024. And I understand that this question was tested. This was tested in 2024, April. 2024, around April, August. So conditions taken into account. Conditions, we talk about conditions taken, we say into account, taken into account in sharing, what's called the revenue, in sharing what's called the revenue, in sharing equitable share of in sharing equitable share, what we call equitable share. We call it the equitable share of national revenue from equitable share of national revenue from national to county government, from national county government. I want to synthesize so that we don't misunderstand. We have it as Article 203, conditions that are taken into account in sharing equitable share of national revenue from national to the county government. Tafadhali, and don't confuse this particular question. Are we attentive? I hope we're attentive. Don't confuse this particular question. Don't confuse that particular question. Do not confuse that particular question. So, if you look at this particular question, when it was tested around 2024, students basically confused this question with Abdinasir, how revenue is being shared amongst the county. But this, when you talk about Article 203, it basically talks about conditions taken into account in equitable share of national revenue from national government to county government, not sharing between county and county together. So this particular question was not performed at that particular time because the student talked about parameters that are used to share revenue amongst the county. But this talks about sharing equitable share of what we call the national revenue from the national to the county government. What are conditions that are taken into account? So one of the first conditions that are taken into account when you have an equitable share of national revenue from the national government to the county, we look at what's called the national interest altogether. We look at the first thing, the national interest. We look at public debt. What is the level of public debt? Because you need to spend money in paying public debt. We also need to look at when you want to take money from national to the county, you need to look at the needs of what we call the national government altogether. We need to look at the needs of the national government. Is health devolved currently? Have we devolved health sector in the county? Have we devolved the health sector? Have we devolved the health sector? Is health a mandate of each? Am I still on national government? Abdinasir, has health been devolved? Very interesting. So those are some of the factors that you basically need to look at altogether. So the needs of the national government. What does the national government basically have altogether? You also need to look at the development need before you share the money. The development needs of the county government are also an issue. Development needs of the county government. You also need to look at issues to do with stability and predictability in allocation of revenue. Stability and what's called predictability in allocation of revenue. So we can talk about five. The others you can get from the note. We say some of the factors we have. One has been national interest as one. We have what's called the public debt. We have needs of the national government, needs of what we call the national government, needs of what we call the national government, stability and predictability. we have what's called stability, and what's called predictability. Stability and what's called predictability. What we call stability and what's called predictability. Stability and what's called predictability in allocation of revenue. In allocation of revenue. In allocation. So we can also talk about the needs of what we call the county government. The needs of what's called the county government. And we just discussed five. We just discussed 5 or 6. The needs flexibility in responding to emergency issues, to deal with flexibility in what's called in responding to what we call to emergencies. Predictability in responding to emergencies. The rest you can get in the notes. But I'm saying do not confuse these questions with what we call parameters that are used to allocate revenue amongst the county government. Do not confuse that with what we call parameters that are used to allocate revenue amongst the counties. Together, gamble. Together, team, we respond with a yes if we are together. That is Article 203. So we need to understand in relation to this that in every fiscal year, as the name be, in every fiscal year, we need to understand that the government will basically spend to allocate, so what they call allocate, what they call a minimum 15% of the revenue to what they call to the county government. So we basically understand that in every fiscal year, the government will essentially spend to allocate a minimum of 15% of the revenue, we'll say, to collected to the county government. Collected, are we together? To the county government. So in every fiscal year, that's why I was talking about a minimum. It can be greater, but say a minimum of 15% of the revenue will definitely be allocated to the county government. Together, we respond with a yes. If you're there, we respond with yes. If we are there, we respond with a yes. Then I want to proceed to what we call Equalization Fund. The next C, still on that one, Equalization Fund. So in this, I basically talked about 0.5% that goes to what we call Equalization Fund. So the question is, if you ask what is an Equalization Fund, what is an Equalization Fund? So this is basically envisioned that chapter that is article, we call it Article 204, envisioned in what's called the Article 204. And on that Article 204, it talks about establish what we call a fund, and you say that 0.5% of all revenue, goes to what we call to the equalization, goes to what we call to the equalization fund. This will definitely goes to what we call the equalization. So on Article 204, it basically established that that 0.5% of what's called all revenue will definitely go to what's called the equalization fund. This would basically go to what's called the equalization fund. So the big question is, what is equalization fund? And where does this, what is the simple meaning? You know, when you talk equalization fund, what comes into your mind when you say equalization fund? What definitely goes into our mind whenever you hear the word equalization fund? So the word equalization fund, whenever you hear the word equalization fund, the word is marginalized. We call it marginalized regions. Are we together? Regions. Regions. So whenever we touch on Equalization Fund, it basically touches on what we call marginalized regions. Marginalized regions. Are we together? Marginalized regions. Examples of marginalized regions in Kenya. Examples of the marginalized regions in Kenya. Which regions in Kenya are northeastern? Are we together? Those regions are marginalized. Marsabit, those are marginalized regions. So this 0.5 is basically supposed to go to those marginalized region, basically to provide what we call basic services. Is to provide basic services. This fund, the 0.5% of that, is supposed to support those marginalized regions. Realize that those regions, if you compare with Nairobi, you compare with Mombasa, you compare with Nakuru, you compare with Kisumu, you realize that they're still way behind. To basically to provide what we call basic services to what we call the marginalized region. To provide what we call the basic services to what we call the marginalized region. Are we together? What are basic services? Make sure the roads are there. Make sure that electricity is there. Make sure that the health is basically supported perfectly well. Make sure that health services are supported altogether. So we need to understand, provide basic service. Yes, water supply. Basic services to what we call to the marginalized. To the marginalized area. Provide what we call basic services to the marginalized areas. So essentially, this is to provide basic services to marginalized areas altogether. Enjoyed by. So these basic services that we enjoy in Nairobi, they don't enjoy them. Are we together? To the level of the rest of the countries. To the level of the rest of the country. To what we call to the level of what we call of the rest of what we call of the country. To the level of what we call the rest of the country. What are those basic services? Basic services. We need to understand those basic services. We have water, we have electricity, and we can mention one. Let's just say electricity, and we can talk about roads, health, etc. Roads, health, etc. So what that really tells me about is to be more appreciative, The people in some regions, even to get an hospital is an issue. Is it true? Every time I think about the marginalized region, I am so grateful. You become so grateful. Sometimes we are not very grateful, but the people, they don't even have health centers is an issue. Or maybe they've just gotten even an health center maybe in the last 2 years. Is it true? Yes. If it's issues to do with education, teachers have not been there, the kids are not going to school altogether. So that is the essence of that Equalization Fund. That is the essence of that Equalization Fund. We respond with the yes. Together. I want to talk about issues of oversight. I just want to mention a number of things on issues of oversight. I want to mention a number of things pertaining to issues pertaining to what we call oversight. Asante Allah. Issues pertaining to oversight. I want to touch on a number of issues that pertains to what we call oversight. A number of issues pertaining to what we call oversight altogether. So number one, at the back of your mind, you need to understand that money not used, that is pertaining to Equalization Fund. Look at, I'm just discussing. Money not used in a fiscal year is carried forward for use in the subsequent year. So if there's no money that was used in the Equalization Fund, it is basically carried to what? To the subsequent year. Are we together? If part of the 0.5% of all revenue that is basically not used for that particular year is carried to what we call to the subsequent year. Then I want to touch on issues of oversight altogether. So in that equalization fund, we basically understand that no fund can be withdrawn. Are we together? No fund can be withdrawn. No fund can be withdrawn without controllers of budget approval. So you cannot withdraw any money. Are we together? You cannot withdraw any money. You cannot withdraw any money from this fund without the approval of what they call the control of the budget. Together. You cannot withdraw any money from what they call the not consolidated, from the equalization fund without you cannot withdraw money from what they call the equalization fund without the approval of what they call the control of the budget. Tafadhali bonyeza yes together. Those are issues of oversight. So then we also have Article 204 clause. Basically envisage that this fund, Article 204, on that article envisage that this fund will be required for 20 years, will definitely be required for 20 years, after which the provision may lapse together. So this fund may be required for at least 20 years. The projection is about 20 years, after which the provision may lapse altogether. But you see, however, the Parliament may extend longevity of the article if necessary. So, based on the provision of Article 204, we say that this fund, the projection is that after 20 years, if this money is provided to those marginalized regions for 20 years, it means that after 20 years, that they should be. However, the Parliament can extend what's called longevity of the article if necessary. Together, team. Are we together? If necessary. So part one, I am done with part one. Together. Perfect. So there's a particular question. I also talk about the exam that not the percentage. So then there's a particular question that was asked, and I don't know why students who are did not answer this question very well. That in the last exam. An examiner asked something, monies that do not go to the consolidated fund. Monies that do not go to the consolidated fund. That question was particularly asked in the last sitting. That which kind of funds do not go to the consolidated fund? We say that there are three things, and you're going to understand them. There is what's called treasury. We have the treasury. We have central bank. And then we have what's called the consolidated fund. But you're going to talk about the consolidated fund. What is the difference between these three things? Blessing. So what is the central bank? Blessing, what is the difference between central bank? What is treasury? And what is the consolidated fund? What is the difference between those three? What is the difference? Though we are going to discuss it. What is the difference between central bank, treasury, and the consolidated fund? Treasury basically comes with formulate policies altogether. They basically formulate policies that govern financial management. So together, they basically come from. But you say the consolidated fund, we say that all government funds, except except where the article says that should not go. All government funds will always be taken to the consolidated fund, except where the Constitution says that that money should not go to the consolidated fund. So a consolidated fund is account in the central bank. Consolidated fund is accounts that is in the central bank, where all government funds are being taken. Tuko sawa team? We respond with a yes. Perfect. So in the last sitting, examiner really played with the students and asked students in the last sitting, and was asking students funds that do not go to the consolidated fund. Why am I talking about it? Funds that do not go to the consolidated fund. Examiner was really playing with the students, funds that do not go to the consolidated fund. One of the funds that does not go to the consolidated fund is the Equalization Fund. Equalization Fund. Does it go to the Equalization Fund? It doesn't go to the Equalization Fund. So one of the funds that does not go to the consolidated fund is equalization. Together with Alan. One of the funds that does not go to the consolidated fund, one of it is what's called the Equalization Fund. Again, when you talk about the county revenue, Anna, county revenue does not go to the consolidated fund. The county revenue does not go to the consolidated fund. Equalization Fund is a fund on its own. It doesn't go to the consolidated fund. Again, county revenue does also not go to the Equalization Fund. You know, when you talk about trust, pension trust, those does not go to them, does not go to the consolidated fund altogether. Those are some of the funds. But we can also talk about some of the funds that are basically constitution, basically projects that should not go to the consolidated fund. So we get to number 2. We have discussed number 1. We talk about other public fund. So that is the second. We call it other. We call it other public funds. Other public funds. The next we call it other public funds. Together, we call it other public funds. I've said, Alan, number 1 is the Equalization Fund. That one does not go to the Equalization Fund. I've talked about County Revenue Fund. I've talked about pension funds altogether. Does that not go to the consolidated fund? But you can also talk about, we said when you talk about except, we can say you can have the last one, except funds that the Constitution basically says that they should not go to the consolidated fund. Together, Alan, tuko sawa? Respond with a yes if you're together. Alan, thank you so much. So then you go to what we call other public funds. So other public funds, when you talk about other public funds, other public, but you can also add, again, Alan, contingency. Alan, we can also talk about contingency fund. Contingency fund. You can add that on contingency funds for emergency. So other public funds that are established are basically 3 other public funds. We have 1, consolidated fund. We have contingency fund. And then we have what's called the revenue fund. So this is the other public funds. So we have what's called the consolidated fund. We have the contingency fund. And then we have what's called the revenue fund together. So I want to start with the first one. I want to start with the first one, and that is what's called the Consolidated Fund. Call it the Consolidated Fund. Consolidated Fund. I want to start with the Consolidated Fund. I hope there's nobody who needs a break. We just finish. Sindio, I hope there's nobody who needs a break. We just roll it and finish it. Just 5 minutes. Let's give them 5 minutes. If somebody says, Alan, Anna, let's give others 5 minutes if they need. That's okay. We record and we proceed. So then we start with the Consolidated Fund. We start with what's called the Consolidated Fund. We start with what's called the Consolidated Fund. And the first thing that I want us to remember whenever we talk about the Consolidated Fund is to understand that all monies and revenue raised by the national government, other than all monies, and what's called in revenue, we say raised, we call it by the national government, all monies and revenue that are raised by the national government, other than one is excluded, other than, we say the ones, we say excluded by what's called by the consolidated, other than the ones that are excluded by the consolidated, So other than the ones that are excluded by Act of Parliament, by Act of what we call of the Parliament. So we say all the money and revenue raised by the national government will essentially go to what we call the Consolidated Fund. Are we together? Is paid to the Consolidated Fund. Is paid to what we call to the Consolidated Fund. Except the ones that are excluded. And I've mentioned, what are these that are excluded? We have what's called the Equalization Fund. We have Equalization Fund excluded. We have contingency. We have the Revenue Fund. We have those that goes to the pension trust, and then you say others that are excluded by the Act of Parliament. Alan, I hope that question has sunk in. Are we together? That question has sunk in. It is at home. So all monies and revenue raised by the national government will always go to the Consolidated Fund, except the ones that are excluded by the Act of Parliament. And I've talked about the monies that are excluded. Perfectly sorted. So then you see, money from the Consolidated Fund can only be withdrawn. How can we draw money from Consolidated Fund? Money from the Consolidated Fund, we call it money. We say money from what we call from the Consolidated Fund. We say Consolidated Fund. We say can only be withdrawn. So from the Consolidated Fund, we say that all revenue what do you mean by Agi? What do you mean by that? Make me understand you. Yes, you say approval by the Parliament altogether. You say accept, can only be withdrawn. Yes, number one, in accordance with Appropriation Act by the Parliament. According to Appropriation Act by what's called the Parliament. Yes, which is the approval. Parliament. Appropriation Act by Parliament. Then the second, as a charge authorized by Constitution or Act of Parliament. As a charge, say authorized, as a charge that is authorized. We say as a charge that is authorized by Constitution or what's called, or the Act of Parliament, or what is called Parliament. As a charge authorized by the Constitution or what's called the Act of Parliament. As a charge authorized by the Constitution or what's called the Act of Parliament. Together. Then you can say money cannot be withdrawn unless it has been approval of control of the budget. We talk about approval by what's called the controller of what we call the budget. Approval by the controller of what we call the budget, except the approval of what we call the controller of the budget. Tuko pamoja. Respond yes. So the next, go to the next fund. We call it the revenue fund. What is revenue fund? We say revenue fund. What is revenue fund? When you say revenue fund, what do you mean by the revenue fund? When you say revenue fund, what is revenue fund? When you say revenue fund, what do we mean by revenue fund? When you say revenue fund, what do you mean? So these are just revenue fund for the county altogether. Accounts, county, yes. This is basically for the county altogether. Revenue for each county government goes into the revenue for each county government goes to the revenue fund. Revenue for what we call for each county government. We say it goes to the revenue fund. To what we call to the revenue fund. So we understand that revenue for each county would definitely go to what we call to the revenue fund. Revenue for each county will go to the revenue fund. Are we together? Or paid to the word paid to the revenue fund. Paid to what we call to the revenue fund. This one's paid to the revenue fund. Or what we call paid to the revenue fund. So in terms of withdrawal from the revenue fund, are we together? When can you make withdrawal? Money can only be withdrawn, are we together, as provided by Act of Parliament. Money can only be withdrawn. Can only be withdrawn as provided by what they call the Act of the Parliament, as provided with what's called the Act of Parliament, as provided by the Act of Parliament. The next we can talk about as provided by the Act of Parliament or county assembly legislation. What we call the county assembly legislation. What we call the county assembly legislation. So we have what we call the Act of Parliament or what we call the county assembly legislation. That you can only withdraw the money based on the Act of Parliament and what we call the county assembly legislation altogether. So again, we need to also understand that money cannot be withdrawn without what we call the county, without the controller of what we call budget approval. You cannot withdraw the money without control of the budget approval together. And that we're done with that. So then we discuss the last fund. We call it contingency fund. So what does the word contingency fund basically mean when you told contingency fund? Contingency fund. So the word contingency, what comes into our mind is emergency. These are what we call emergency. We call it emergency. So for the contingency, at the back of our mind, we need to understand the word emergency comes into our mind. It is an emergency fund. So you say used for the fund is used for we say is used for what we call unforeseen. The fund is used for what we call unforeseen. The fund is used for unforeseen. And we call it urgent expenditure and urgent expenditure. And you say, and its operation is in accordance with the Act of Parliament. Operation is in accordance with what you call with the Act of Parliament. And its operation, we understand, is in accordance with the Act of what we call Parliament. And it's in the Act of Parliament. Its operation is basically in and its operation is in accordance with the Act of Parliament. So then we move to part 3. So part 3. Part 3 talks about revenue raising power and public debt. Revenue raising power, revenue, call it raising power, and what we call and public debt. So that is where we start in our next class. Revenue raising powers and the public debt. I want to look back and say thank you so much. I know it's not easy. It is not easy to wake up in the morning. I appreciate your sacrifice. And my prayer is that I appreciate your sacrifice, and my prayer is that you continue with the good work. My prayer is that you continue with the good work. I hope you're done. My prayer is that. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. You are our warriors. Everything will be okay, Alan. Yes. Thank you, Liz. Good day.